Okay, we're back for the last hour of the May lectures. The goal here is to wrap up my very brief and pathetic presentation on John and then spend some time on the book of Revelation. And then I want to speak about, again, the work of exegesis and an introduction to the lectionary system. Okay? I trust you maybe know a great deal about the lectionary because maybe you're a reader in your parish, or you're just been a Bible study person in your own parish. So I'm sorry if that will be redundant, but for others, maybe there'll be some insight on it. I spoke about the 7 signs that are the backbone of the first half of John's Gospel. Here they are, just so you can say you've heard them. The wedding at Cana is the first one, and that's chapter 2. In chapter 4, there's, or is it the end of chapter 2? I'm not even sure where it is. There's the story of the centurion who has a servant who is healed by Jesus. Then there's the paralyzed man at the sheep pool. That's chapter 5. Jesus feeds the multitudes. That's chapter 6. Immediately following that is Jesus walking on water. In chapter 9, as we heard this last Lent, the man born blind. And again, as we heard in Lent, chapter 11, the story of the healing of Lazarus. Again, these are powerful works, I grant you that. But John sees them as doorways, portals into the person of who Jesus is. That's always his concern. Who is Jesus? I had you in for your homework just to read chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Chapter 4, chapter 4, chapter 9, chapter 11 are all premiered during the Lenten lectionary in Cycle A. Again, it's been a very unusual Lent. Much of that we spent under lockdown, but those episodes, those passages are chosen. They are long chapters, and they focus on characters who are not just one-dimensional. In the Samaritan woman story, you have a narrative about a woman who is suspicious of Jesus, and how in her interaction he wears down her suspicion. He touches her true inner thirst, which is not a water thirst, it's a thirst for acceptance, for meaning, and she becomes an evangelizer, speaking to other people in Samaria. So we see the reason, premier reason that passage is kept for Lent is its portrayal of somebody growing in faith and eventually being, say, an evangelizer. In chapter 9, the man born blind, the emphasis is on how that man grows, but he grows in faith by facing resistance. He, at the beginning, refers to Jesus as simply that man or a prophet, but by the end, he is ready to see him as, indeed, God's agent. In the 11th chapter, we have Jesus confronting the ultimate mystery of the meaning of death, and he proves himself stronger than it. And his love is stronger than death. He weeps, and it's his love that's able to empower Lazarus to return. So these 3 have been seen as key passages to be shared with catechumens, the elect, preparing for baptism. Again, in each of those cases, the focus is on Jesus. One chapter that I had you read that I haven't really addressed is chapter 10. And I just want you to look at it briefly. Again, John is written in very simple Greek. It's almost monosyllabic. If you learn Greek, the text that you start reading, maybe you read the letters of John and then you read the Gospel of John, because it's so simple, sentence structure, and the words are so simple, but the meaning is quite profound. Chapter 10 is read on the 4th Sunday of Easter. It is it's the passage from which comes the reference to Jesus as the Good Shepherd. He also speaks about the others. This follows right behind the story of the man born blind, where Jesus says that those who were blind now see, and that those who see have become blind, referencing the Pharisees who have been giving him grief. In the same vein, Jesus talks about the Good Shepherd and those who are not so good, those who think about themselves. Again, it's a reference to the leaders, the hirelings, he calls them, the leaders of the community. And he is the Good Shepherd. I want you just to look frankly at a couple verses, just only. Chapter 10, verse 11. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He'll talk later about, no one takes my life from me, I lay it down. This fundamental vision of John's gospel is that nobody took Jesus' life from him. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a miscarriage of justice. Well, it was a miscarriage of justice, but it wasn't a surprise accident. It is all part of his plan as the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. No one takes my life from me, I lay it down. Which leads me back to my words this earlier today about the gospel of passion that's read on Good Friday. It's called Good Friday because it isn't merely a tragic story. Oh, too bad about Jesus. It's really about God at his revealing himself. This is his hour of glory. There's been references, actually in chapter 1, there was a reference to God's glory. Glory is a concept in the Bible. It's kavod is the word in Hebrew. Kavod. It means heavy, weighty. It's the light. Glory is the light around divine things. You know, when the sun is covered by the moon during an eclipse, there'll be rays of light, a corona around the edges of the moon. That literally is glory. You don't get to see God directly. Remember, no one sees God face to face, but we can see his glory. In John's gospel, glory is the visible representation of God we see in Christ. And the preeminent place where we see that is in the cross. 3 times in John, Jesus will talk about, the first half of John, Jesus will talk about being lifted up. The Son of Man will be lifted up. Now, that concept of lifted up has kind of 2 meanings. Think of a basketball coach who wins a state championship, okay? And the team rallies around and lifts him up on the shoulders and celebrates what we've done. Look at, he's in his glory. But in John's gospel, again, remember, things have more than one meaning. In John's gospel, this is God's glory. This is God revealing himself most completely. Most completely. This is God in his glory. The most perfect human being who ever lived at the hour of his greatest glory. And we want to be like him. That's, in a sense, the message of John. With chapter 13, and go look at it briefly, chapter 13, in fact, most commentators talk about the first 12 chapters as the book of signs, and chapters 13 through 21 as the book of glory, in this double sense of lifted up and nailed to a cross. That's the 2 signs, the 2 images of lifted up. It takes place at the Last Supper. That is, in chapter 13 is the discussion about the betrayer, the washing of feet. And with chapter 14, 15, 16, and 17 are Jesus' great Last Supper discourse, his great speech. I should back up. The 7 signs, each of them there usually is a long conversation that follows afterwards where Jesus explains what this means. Not in every case, that's exaggeration. But primarily there's a lot of talk from Jesus as he explains what this sign says about him. Well, at the Last Supper, after washing Jesus' feet, there is, by the way, in John, no Jesus taking bread and wine and identifying himself with it. This is my body given for you, my life's blood poured out for you. That's a shock maybe to you. But what John has to offer on that, he is folded into the 6th chapter, the big discourse that Jesus gives after feeding the multitudes with loaves. He identifies himself as the living bread come down from heaven. But back to chapter 13, after the washing of the feet, after Judas leaves, Jesus begins his discussion. Let not your hearts be troubled. This is chapter 14. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. You know this text is frequently read at funerals. But Jesus begins this discourse, and it's rich and beautiful and a little bit repetitive. Jesus says things in chapter 14 that he comes back to in chapter 16. But then chapter 17 ends with, or comes, and it is it's a long prayer. Jesus' Last Supper words are a long address to the Father. He prays to the Father for himself about, glorify your name, help me address what's coming. He prays for the disciples around the table, and then he says in a powerful passage, Father, I pray not just for these, but for those who will believe in me because of their name. He's praying for us. He has our gathering in mind. Every time you assemble, Jesus had been aware of us at the Last Supper and prays that we might be one. With chapter 18 and 19 is the Passion. As I've already earlier, I began talking about that. And I did that because it's the passage from the Synoptics that you know well. And my fear is that you've never really heard John, because even though the words are proclaimed each Good Friday, not everybody is at Good Friday service. And because you think you know the story, you don't always hear it as it is. Turn to chapter 20. That is, this is the resurrection appearance. There are 2 chapters, chapter 20 and chapter 21. I want to emphasize just chapter 20. There are 2 characters that are meant for our imitation. Mary of Magdala and Thomas. Okay? Mary Magdala discovers the tomb empty, alone. She's alone. There's no other women with her. And she goes back and tells the others. 2 of them, Peter and the beloved disciple, hoof it out to the empty tomb and discover it. The beloved disciple gets there first. Let me read that portion. They both ran, this is verse 4, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first, and stooping to look in, saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him. He went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying, and the napkin which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and he believed. The beloved disciple figure surfaces first at the Last Supper. He is on Jesus's right side. The dining in the ancient world is not like Leonardo da Vinci portrayed it, a long table with chairs and everybody on their side of the table. Instead, it's more like this. There would be a low table, kind of think like a coffee table, what's called a coffee table, and then there would be benches. And if it's a big group, the benches would be arranged like spokes, that's the word, spokes on a wheel. And everybody's head is towards the table, and their feet are on the other end. By the way, that explains how, in Luke's gospel, how the nameless woman who comes in and washes Jesus' feet is able to reach him. She's not crawling underneath the table. She is approaching from the outside, and his feet are sticking out, so it's easy for her to approach. Anyway, this is the vision of middle-class dining for a feast. And let's say this is Jesus here, and they're tighter together. Peter is on, let's say they're looking this way. Peter is here, and the beloved disciple is here. And so Jesus says something about who's going to betray him, and Peter looks to the beloved disciple to ask Jesus, because Jesus is facing his direction. So he conveys or finds out from Jesus who this is. So that's his first appearance. He appears later. He knows the high priest, and so he gets in, beloved disciple. He gets in and gets Peter in. He's at the cross, of course. He's the figure to which Jesus refers when he says, "Son, behold your mother. Mother, behold your son." He is there in the, as we just saw, on Easter morning. Now, who is this figure? Tradition for centuries has held it to be John. And I just want to caution you into saying, well, he's the beloved disciple. He probably is the apostle behind this gospel. But I think it probably goes beyond what we can know for sure. Tradition says that John is the beloved disciple. I like to keep that just a little bit open, because not that it matters, I guess, in the big picture. Whoever the beloved disciple is, he will not be offended if we fasten the wrong name to him. But he's a key figure in the gospel. He is the apostle. He's the link to Jesus for the people for whom this document was their first gospel. Okay? So, and you notice there's a little competition. Beloved disciple knows the high priest. He lets Simon Peter in. Simon Peter is important, but it's the beloved disciple to whom the mother of Jesus is handed over. And here, on Easter Sunday, the beloved disciple gets there first, but out of respect, he lets Peter look first, and then he looks in. Peter looks in and doesn't know what to make of it, but it says of the beloved disciple that he looked in and he believed. Verse 8, the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. Okay, so he's kind of always one step up, at least up through chapter 20. He's one step up on Peter. In 21, it's Peter who's one step up on the beloved disciple. Jesus says to Peter, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep," 3 times, and gives him that particular role. Okay, but back to the text here. The beloved disciple and Peter run away. Mary Magdalene is left. This is the famous scene where she thinks she sees Christ, risen Christ. She associates him as the gardener, and only when Jesus calls her by name does the scales fall from her eyes, and she recognizes him. Okay, Rabboni. Jesus said, "Do not hold me," verse 17. "I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God." Throughout John's Gospel, Jesus has not taught the disciples the Lord's Prayer, okay? Because in John's Gospel, he is the unique Son of God. And Jesus constantly refers to God as a Father. But here now, after his resurrection, Jesus tells Mary Magdalene to tell the others that he is ascending to my Father and your Father. So the Easter experience has transformed their relationship to God as well, as Jesus, the Word, returns to the source. Okay? Verse 19. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Again, Jesus said to them, "Peace. As the Father has sent me, even so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. So this is the famous Easter night moment when Jesus appears to all the disciples. He had every reason to be upset with them. Okay? Remember, they all abandoned him. But his first word to them is peace. He repeats it a second time, and he breathes on them. Again, I told you before that the word ruach is breath and wind and spirit. So, as modern people, when somebody breathes on us, we get all upset, because we're concerned about how our breath appears. That's not at all the evangelist's concern. What Jesus is doing is he's sharing with them his own life. Just as in the synoptics, the Father pours the Spirit out on the Son after his baptism, Jesus breathes on them, giving them a share of his own life, his own breath. And this is where the root of assigning, giving to them the power over the forgiveness of sins comes. I said it before. Catholic Church has defined the literal meaning of only a handful of texts. So we have a great deal of freedom in trying to interpret and read the Bible. But this is one text that the Church has defined. So check at your footnotes. If you've got a New American Bible, you'll see a footnote to this that says this is the scriptural warrant for the sacrament of reconciliation. Now, it can be more than that, but it's not less than that. So the Church defines so that we understand that root. Okay. Now, this is the famous episode with Thomas not there. And again, poor Thomas. I'm on a crusade to stop calling him doubting, because he's not doubting. He doesn't doubt Jesus. He doubts the disciples. When they tell him he's risen, he goes, yeah, right. You all ran away. Why should I believe you? Your guilty consciences are making you, you imagine this so you don't feel so bad. And then 8 days later, we celebrate that on the second Sunday of Easter. We read this gospel where Jesus does appear and he gives to Thomas the same thing he gave to the others. He showed them his hands and side. He let them test to see. So Thomas is not asking for anything out of line. He's only asking it because the disciples told him that this is what he did. But here's the climax. Here's the climax. Verse 27. Put your finger here, Jesus says, and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. My Lord and my God is the strongest, most high Christological address anybody gives Jesus in John's Gospel. Remember, Lord, that's Yahweh, remember, by way of Adonai, and my God. So Thomas's confession is the highest confession of that Jesus is divine. And then Jesus' words to Thomas, it's almost like Jesus turns to his audience, because he's speaking to us who are centuries removed. He says, blessed are those, have you believed because you have seen me? And he turns, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So this is the evangelist's words to his reader. Now he continues, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in him. Two things are going on there. As I've already intimated several times, the evangelists aren't trying to tell us everything about Jesus. They are, though. They've made their selection. They've gone down the buffet table and chosen the items that are most appropriate for their audience. So there are many other words and deeds of Jesus than these, but these have been selected in this book that you might believe that Jesus, this is the purpose of the gospel, that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that you may have life in him. Now, scholars propose that this was the conclusion of the original Gospel of John, but that there was a second edition, kind of, when chapter 21 was added. Let's read that, because there's another conclusion. Verse 25. There are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Okay. In the time remaining, I want to look at the book of Revelation, not because maybe it's so vitally important, but I want to get you ready, because this is a book that people have gotten lost in over and over and over again. When I say Revelation, as in Bible, book of Revelation, what people tend to have in their mind is fortune telling. Okay? A palm reader, or a woman with her hair up in a kind of a veil with a glass globe in front of her, looking to see what the spirits are saying. Get that out of your mind. There are lots of Christians who read Revelation as the countdown to the end of time. And that is, I would suggest to you, a misreading of the book. When I laid out the variety of the writings in the Catholic canon, I lined up some Old Testament sorts of books with New Testament parallels. So the Torah, the basic story in Judaism, parallels the Gospels, the basic Christian story. The histories of the Old Testament are paralleled by the Acts of the Apostles. The prophets in the Old Testament are paralleled by Revelation. Revelation is a kind of prophetic book. And we have the same problem with prophecy as fortune telling. But my main image to you then was a prophet is like a doctor who reads the signs and can suggest how you should go. Because if you don't go, here's what could happen. The doctor does not want you to have a heart attack. So if you heed him, you will avoid that. So in the same sense, Revelation is a book of prophecy. Revelation is one example of a whole genre of literature composed between 200 BC and 200 AD that has its own rules. And this kind of writing was not meant to frighten the bejesus out of us. It was meant to give us hope. That book, or that kind of writing, is called by moderns apocalyptic. Calypso is to unveil, to veil. Okay? Apocalypto is to unveil. So to take away that which blocks your vision. Another word for it, the word apocalypsis in Greek has been rendered into Latin as revelatio, revelation, to reveal, to pull back. Now again, in our minds, so much revelation is fortune telling, but again, think of it as an unveiling. It's a prophetic message. It's a prophetic message. Not necessarily a book of strategic countdown for the steps before the end of the world. Christian history is filled with individuals who have tried to do just that. And guess what? They've been wrong every time. The first example I can think of is a man named Montanus in the 2nd century in modern-day Turkey. He gathered people together at Pepuza in Turkey because he believed that Jesus was going to come for everybody. It happened over and over and over again, particularly in the High Middle Ages. The year 1325 or 1300 was a year that was filled with anxiety. The age of the Reformation, the wars of religion, were seen as being played out. But in our own time, how many years ago was it? This gentleman, California. He was very old, and he had people handing out stuff. You know, remember the Mayan calendar, hoo-ha? I mean, we like to present that we know the secret. You know, it's powerful to say, I know the secret. That's why we gossip, huh? I know something about you, and I'm going to tell you about it. And that's where that comes from. But and the Catholic Church has had its own share in this. But one thing about being a church that's been around a long time with a memory is we've gone through that and realized maybe that's not the way it should be understood. Apocalyptic, I'm going to give you a formal definition of what it is. Okay? Now, I do it slowly because it's very rich. Remember, apocalyptic is a modern scholarly term. It's a type of revelatory literature in a narrative framework in which otherworldly beings disclose details of a transcendent reality to a human recipient. It can be temporal when it discloses news of a divine saving intervention, and it can be spatial when it's about taking a journey into another world. I'll say it again. A type of revelatory literature in a narrative framework in which an otherworldly being discloses details of a transcendent reality, a spiritual being, to a human recipient, which can be temporal as it discloses news of a divine saving intervention, something's going to happen, or spatial when it's about taking us on a journey into another world. The book of Enoch is really a collection of writings that comes from about a little bit before Jesus until about the 2nd century. It's both. In Enoch, there are angelic beings. Actually, Enoch himself from the book of Genesis comes and explains how history is going to unfold, and then takes the reader on a journey into the heavens so we can see where the sun comes out of its chute and where the storehouses of the snow and the hail and rain are kept. Okay, so they're spatial, about what heavens look like, temporal, about something that's going to come. There's a lot of literature between 200 BC and 200 AD that was written in this vein. The book of Daniel, the last half of Daniel, is apocalyptic. The Gospels have a couple little chapters in it, the book of Revelation itself, but they're just a handful of a whole bookshelf of writings that came at that time. Why? Well, in Judaism, I think it was a time when apocalyptic literature is very popular when people feel like their hands are tied. You know, that human effort by itself can't accomplish anything. We need God to step in. We need the angels to break through if we're going to achieve anything. And so in times of, think, among whom is literature like this most attractive? People on the edges, people in the lower ranks of a culture, people in charge. They don't read this sort of stuff because they're in charge. They don't want change. Apocalyptic is about change, about God making the world what He wants it to be. Through the nearly 2,000 years of reading it, there are 3 different schools of interpretation about the book of Revelation. The first is the one that's easiest to relate to, even though it's erroneous in my mind. That's futurist. That's reading the book as prediction, that it makes one-to-one identifications. But because they're always wrong, those identifications have to be changed. So I told you, Montanus, the 2nd century, predicted the end of the world. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened yet. Think of the Left Behind books. How many of you read them? What a waste of your time, huh? The futurist vision is what's really popular among fundamentalist, literalist, conservative Christians. Okay? A second school is idealist. That is, you understand the text to be about big ideas, timeless truths. You know, that's about eternal combat between good and evil. Augustine had no time for this, but St. Augustine was one of these. And to give you an example, with all the concern about the Antichrist. Now, the word Antichrist never appears in Revelation. It's not there at all. But Augustine said, who is the Antichrist? I mean, that's a big concern, that you Left Behind series. Who is the Antichrist? Well, Augustine said, I am the Antichrist when I do things that are against God's will. I am Antichrist. See? He universalizes the story. It's about all of us. A third school, and one that is most common today, most popular, the word preterist, P-R-E-T-E-R-I-S-T, not a word you use very often. It literally means one who favors the past, a preterist. This reading of Revelation recognizes that it was originally addressed to real people in the first century. And while it may have lessons for us, it may be timeless in one sense, it all begins in trying to understand what it means to first century readers. Okay. This is the most, I think, the most effective way. I'm not dismissing this one completely. I am dismissing this one. But this idea of what did it mean to the first centuries? What did the people who read it first understand it to be about? And the book has help for us in that regard. The book of Revelation is written by a man named John the Seer. The one who can perceive, Now, sloppy Christians have associated that this equals John the Apostle, and that, of course, equals the beloved disciple. Well, again, I'm pretty sketchy about that, and that one too. So I will not call him St. John or John the Apostle. He is named John. He introduces himself to us, but he's John the Visionary. We don't know anything about him for sure. That's why people want to associate him with the apostles, so we claim to know something. The author is thoroughly shaped and formed in the Old Testament. He doesn't quote any Old Testament verse directly, but he has hundreds of allusions, references. In chapter 1, Jesus is described. He appears to John and going to give him his revelation, and he's wearing a white robe with a golden sash. Well, all of that is taken from the book of Daniel. The angel Gabriel comes to Daniel, and guess what? He's wearing a white robe with a golden sash. So my way of describing it is that the Old Testament, particularly Isaiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Daniel, Zechariah, are the coloring box from which the seer uses to relay his visions. If you want to know what the problems were, again, a preterist says that we got to ask, what did the original author, readers understand by it? The way to find that out is to read the letters that are in chapters 2 and 3. That's part of your reading assignment, in chapter 1, Jesus appears to John the seer, and it says, I've got a message for the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Asia Minor is western modern-day Turkey. And these cities are all in a circle, all about 40 or 50 miles apart. So the book of Revelation is kind of like a circular letter. It went from church to church to church to church. And after the first chapter, which reveals the Christ coming to purvey the message, in chapters 2 and 3, Jesus has messages for the 7 churches. And in every case, the church has problems. And you're not going to be surprised. The problems are the same ones that we have. You know, to be a Christian was to be set apart, but there was quite an emphasis on fitting in. You'll see references to eating meat. Now, why is eating meat a problem? Most meat in the ancient world came through the local pagan temple. And so to eat meat, when you came to my house, if I served you meat, you are, in a sense, you're dining with a deity, with Zeus or Apollo. And so for the churches of this region, Christians have been taught, John the Seer has been taught not to eat that meat. But to fit in, you gotta have to go to the parties. You gotta be seen at the mayor's wedding, mayor's daughter's wedding. And so the idea of assimilating, of kind of fitting in. A second problem is external persecution. Christians were, during this period, not facing murder and death too much. There's one individual in the book who has referenced as who's died for his faith, Antipas. But there's a threat, there's a growing threat of persecution. And so the tendency is to want to hide, to assimilate because of this external threat. And then the other problem is complacency. Jesus famously says in one of the visions, I wish you were hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm, I spit you from my mouth. Okay? Now, these are our problems, aren't they? We don't want to stand out. We want to fit in. We don't want to be made fun of because we're Catholic. We're facing a tension that we didn't used to feel between culture and our church and what its values are. And so the tendency is to be lackadaisical and complacent. Another thing to learn or to remember about the text is it operates at two levels. There's upstairs and downstairs. Always pay attention to what's happened, where you are. Because upstairs in heaven, chapters 4 and 5 are a vision of heaven. John sees an open door, and he's taken up by an angel, and he's shown the throne room of God. And then he sees the Lamb of God, who's Christ, in the same throne room. And everything in heaven is orderly and in its place and musical. There's always singing, always beautiful. While down below on earth there is mayhem and murder and disease, destruction, chaos. Now there's a very obvious challenge. Which is it going to be for you? Do you want to be among the heavenly number, or do you want to throw in your lot with the beasts that rule the earth? Consider the story of Revelation not as a historical tale that begins with chapter 1 and then goes to the end in chapter 21, but think of it instead as a spiral, because there's a series of sevens, and the story is really that series of seven. Round and round and round we go. Okay? Think of it like the Terminator film, remember? This I can't think of the name, you know the name of this creature who can't be destroyed. Arnold comes back to destroy the creature, and every time it's destroyed, it comes back and reconstitutes itself. Well, like that, this cycle of evil reappears and has to be stomped on over and over again. All right? What is the basic plot line? The basic plot line is things are not well with you. Okay? Things are not well in the church. And there is a growing opposition to the church. And if we don't get our act together, we're not going to be able to stand. We're going to fail because we fit into the background. Because we're lazy. So when persecution comes, we're going to not stand up. We're not going to be what we need to be. The deeper into the book you go, okay, the further along the cycles of seven, the author will hand over more and more tidbits to explain things. So, for example, there is a woman who rides a beast, okay, and she's described as a whore. And who is that woman? Well, eventually you find out, by the time you get to chapter 18, it's the city of Rome. The city of Rome. And then there's a beast. There's a series of beasts. There's the red dragon. That's pretty easily identifiable as the evil one, devil himself, the red dragon. But he's got two helpers. One's called the beast from the sea, and the other is the beast from the land. And together, they're an unholy trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You've got the dragon, and you've got the beast from the sea, and the beast from the land. So, because evil likes to imitate good, evil hides as good, right? Well, so the dragon we get, the dragon is pretty easily identifiable as the evil one. Who are the beasts? Now, this is a lot of energy goes into this. Chapter 13, at the end of chapter 13, let me just read it to you. Because at this point, the author starts revealing his hand. And he says, he talks about the beast, and he says, the beast from the land. He says, "This calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is a human number. Its number is 666. Okay, that's the famous line. I told you earlier, I think it was last lectures or two, that for Greeks and for Latin, Romans, and for Hebrew speakers, the alphabet also had numeric number value. Again, like Roman numeral, X is 10. So you can take a name, you can put in its numerical value. So we've got graffiti. I love the girl whose number is 72. Okay. Now, the girl whose name is equals 72 knows who she is. There are lots of names probably that could add up to 72. So it's not quite as clear. This 666 thing has become huge guesswork throughout the centuries. Martin Luther accused the Pope of being the Antichrist, and the Pope accused Martin Luther. If you've read War and Peace, Tolstoy's novel, one of the characters in the novel identifies Napoleon as the beast. Ronald Wilson Reagan, our president in the 80s, his names each have 6 characters in. Do you remember Barney? I love you, you love me. If you take cute, purple, dinosaur, spell it out, and then drop down all the letters that correspond to a Latin numerical value. C is 100. U, and they didn't have U in Roman numerals, they had V, so that's 5. T and E don't count. Here's another 5. If you do this, what do you get, you suppose, You're right, 666. So Barney is the beast. Now, the people who wrote this and the people who read it didn't need to know who was oppressing them. Actually, the name Nero Kaiser in Hebrew letters, again, it's written in Greek. If you take Nero Kaiser in Hebrew characters, it equals 666. I told you earlier today about the first persecution that broke out after the fire in Rome. So that's the backdrop to the first generations that are facing this problem. Again, I don't want to waste more time on it. Chapter 19, and there's a great deal of build-up about a battle. But when you get to chapter 19, the battle's never described. Chapter 19, 19 and 20. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had worked the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast. Blah, 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 blah. And that's it, So there's no real gore, no really bloody story. We love that, but that's not provided us. The final battle is never described. Chapter 21 ends with a vision of the heavenly city coming down. And it's talking about the happy ending. The curious thing is, in Revelation, it's not about us going to heaven. It's about heaven coming to earth. Okay? Now the big book is filled with images, and you can just totally get lost in it. But let me give you this summary of it, frankly. It's a book of hope. The early church was facing internal and external problems. And the author sensed there was going to be governmental resistance. During the last half of the first century, emperors like Nero, like Domitian, later, are going to begin to call themselves more and more as divine. Rome itself is a god, Roma, and citizens were expected to worship Roma and the whole Roman hoo-ha. Jews were exempted and Christians resisted. And so the author is urging his readers to say that step up, stop being so sluggish and complacent, stop wanting to fit in, make yourself strong, because we are about to be tested, because the times are such. So in a sense, this is a wonderful book for the present, not because it names figures that that's the president and that's the senator, and no, but because I think in our lifetime we sense a little more tension. We are out of joint with our culture. My parents grew up where the enemy was communism. It's out there. Huh? Well, now the evil one, the beast, is here among us. Huh? And that's the beauty of the book. It continually is fresh. The dragon is always out there, but he's always finding new incarnations. You know, back in the 40s, it was easy to think of Hitler and Stalin as the beasts. Well, now it's a little closer. It's a little closer to home. I think it's cell phones. Huh? I think it's technology. I think it's Barney. Anyway, so we're called to be alert, but to remember in whose hands history is held. That's why the book ends with heaven coming to earth. Remember who is in charge of history. We may suffer. We may lose our life. Be ready for that. Because in the end, God is in charge. God is in charge. You know, as more than one person has quipped, I read the end of the book. We win. Okay? So do not see Revelation as a book, a countdown, trying to name names and accuse people. It's meant to be a book of hope, of urging us to step up, to grow a backbone, to be ready to witness to our faith, and to live it in whatever guise the dragon is incarnated in our day. I began this course talking about exegesis. Exegesis is to draw the meaning out of a text, not to impose your agenda on a text, but you've got to sit and listen and let it come to you. You've got to ask questions from it, about it. And that's what the historical critical method is. It's a series of tools we use to try to crack the nut of a message from long ago. The people who wrote these books are gone. I can't ask them what they meant. So we use the tools of source criticism and literary criticism and textual criticism to try to understand what the author intended. That's the first step. What did the author intend? And then what does it mean to me? I gave you a handout many days ago, weeks ago, months ago, that on one side had 10 Old Testament themes. Those 10 themes came from a book by a man named Lawrence Boat. So they're really good. To balance that, I came up with 10 New Testament themes. Words or terms that you would do well to understand. These are the kinds of things that a theology of the New Testament would give you. So do look at them and see if you identify them and can understand what they're trying to say. The 10 New Testament themes. Time relating, I just want to talk about the lectionary. Again, this is the part that some of you already know. Others may not. A lectionary is a system a way of reading the Bible. The Bible's a big book. It's a library, huh? Remember? It's a library. And how do we as a church body read it? There are churches where the minister gets to pick. On any given Sunday, he picks a verse or a little bit. Now, the beauty of that is he can pick out the best, most juicy parts. The bad part is he may be ignoring things that don't seem, I mean, I've heard lots of TV lectures or TV preaching on John 3:16. I have never heard anybody preach, any TV preacher, evangelist, non-Catholic, preach on Matthew 16. You are Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church. Huh? We can select what we want to. A lectionary is meant to help us face everything. Even so, we don't face everything in our Catholic lectionary. As one of the fruits of Vatican II, the previous lectionary system that we used only had 2 readings and a verse from the Old Testament book of Psalms. It was a gospel and an epistle, letters of Paul and a gospel text. There was only 1 year's cycle. So there were 50 plus holy days. There were 52 Sundays worth of selections. And what's missing? No Old Testament, except there was 1 or 2 verses from a psalm that was called the Gradual. There had been a more robust lectionary system in the early church, but it kind of got whittled and compressed and whittled and compressed. So as one of the fruits of the Vatican Council, the Catholic Church restudied the question and developed a rich lectionary in an attempt to respond to the Vatican II Fathers' desire that the Bible in its more completely be shared with Catholics. So the Sunday lectionary is based this way. There is what we will call special seasons, what I'll call special seasons. And then there's what we call ordinary time. Special seasons are, you know them, Advent, Christmas, Lent, and Easter. It amounts to about 1/4 of the church year. Now, the main process here is thematic. The editors have chosen texts that undergird and support the season. So during Advent, for example, we read a lot of Isaiah because he's a visionary. On that day, this is what God wants the world to be. During Lent this year, we read a lot of John. Easter, we read more John, okay? And so, but they're usually thematic, they're themes. So, second Sunday of Easter, we always read Thomas. Fourth Sunday of Easter, we always read Good Shepherd, John 10. So there's thematic concerns. And the readings tend to be chosen to reflect these basic themes. So during Lent, Cycle A, we've had these mega readings from John, John 4, John 9, John 11. But the first readings from the Old Testament have been a kind of a summary of the story of the Old Testament story of salvation. So we always have a early Genesis reading, we always have an Abraham reading, then we always have a Moses reading, then we have a prophet, and then we have a history book reading. So they're thematic. So but there's a 3-year cycle, always a 3-year cycle. So there's except some at Christmas we always read the same story on Christmas. But on Easter Sunday, Cycle A, at the Vigil this year, we read Matthew's version of Jesus' appearance. Next year we'll read Mark's version. The following year it's Luke's version. So we read one year after the other. During ordinary time, weekdays and Sundays, the system is different. But it's directed by 3 years. And I've already alluded to that. Cycle A, the gospel is the main driver. In Cycle A, it's Matthew. Cycle B, it's Mark. Cycle C, it's